The screen flickered inside a dimly lit room on the outskirts of Damascus. Two Mossad operatives sat motionless, their eyes locked on intercepted footage, showing a convoy of black SUVs cutting through the desert. Every pixel of that image represented years of pursuit, years of tracking one of the most elusive men in the Middle East. "We've got movement from the Quds Force channel," one whispered in Hebrew. The other leaned forward. "It's him. The ghost is moving." And just like that, the hunt reignited. Before we dive deep into this operation, make sure you've subscribed, because what you're about to hear isn't fiction. These are the real, declassified events of one of Mossad's most secret missions, a story that reshaped the Middle East forever. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and let's get into it. Qasem Soleimani wasn't just any commander. He was the shadow strategist of Iran's military ambitions, the mastermind behind the Quds Force, the elite arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. He built Tehran's influence across the region not with speeches, but with proxy wars. In Lebanon, his allies armed Hezbollah with tens of thousands of rockets. In Syria, he orchestrated Iran's military presence to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. In Iraq, he built and controlled powerful militias loyal only to him. To Israel, that made him the most dangerous man alive. Every rocket that landed on Israeli soil, every drone that breached its airspace, and every militia that circled its borders traced back to Soleimani's strategies. Mossad gave him a code name: the Ghost. Soleimani had a talent for invisibility. He changed routes at the last minute, never used the same aircraft twice, and often traveled disguised as a civilian diplomat. He appeared suddenly in Aleppo, then vanished into Baghdad. Western intelligence services saw his movements as unpredictable chaos, but Mossad noticed patterns. He always traveled personally to oversee crucial operations, and his presence meant something big was about to happen. Inside Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv, the walls of a restricted operations room were covered with satellite images, intercepted communications, and red string lines connecting dots across Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. It was the beating heart of a years-long project, the Soleimani File. Every detail, from flight manifests to radio frequencies, was recorded. Dozens of analysts worked in silence, piecing together fragments of information to build a digital shadow of the man himself. The surveillance extended deep into hostile territory. Israeli cyber units infiltrated communication networks of Iranian-backed militias. Electronic listening posts in northern Israel, Cyprus, and the Red Sea intercepted encrypted transmissions. Mossad's human assets, carefully placed over years, reported from inside Iraq and Syria. Each small clue was filtered and cross-checked until a larger picture began to form. What emerged was terrifyingly clear. Soleimani wasn't merely coordinating defenses. He was engineering an offensive strategy meant to encircle Israel. He was supplying Hezbollah with guided missile technology, setting up drone bases in Syria, and attempting to establish a permanent corridor of Iranian control from Tehran to the Mediterranean. To Mossad, this wasn't just influence. It was preparation for a future war. That realization changed everything. The Israeli government authorized a covert directive to track Soleimani continuously and without restriction. The mission wasn't simply to monitor him, it was to understand his mind, his routines, his weak points. Mossad called it Operation Shadow Net. By 2017, Israel's intelligence web had expanded across the region. Spy satellites from OFEC units hovered above Syria, tracking every vehicle that left Damascus International Airport. Drones disguised as commercial surveyors flew along the Iraqi border. hidden cameras captured footage of convoys leaving Iranian bases under cover of night. Mossad operatives disguised as journalists, engineers, and contractors operated in cities where being Israeli was a death sentence. Through this network, Mossad learned that Soleimani often hand-delivered instructions to field commanders, especially in Syria and Iraq. He believed sensitive plans were too dangerous to transmit digitally, making his personal travel essential to Iran's regional dominance. Ironically, that devotion to secrecy became his greatest vulnerability. Still, he remained elusive. Several times, Israeli analysts believed they had his convoy pinpointed, only to learn it was a decoy. Mossad learned the hard way that Soleimani's security protocol was nearly flawless. His motorcade changed formation mid-route, and his communications were routed through intermediaries. Even the CIA, with its vast reach, had failed to maintain consistent eyes on him. But Mossad had patience, and time was their greatest weapon. In 2018, the operation entered a new phase. A cyber breach into Iranian aviation databases revealed partial flight schedules linked to senior Revolutionary Guard officials. Cross-referencing those logs with on-ground surveillance began to narrow Soleimani's movements. Over months, a pattern appeared: his flights from Tehran to Damascus, then unannounced trips from Syria to Baghdad, often aligning with major Iranian operations in the region. Each step of the way, Mossad tightened the net, not to strike yet, but to understand. To them, intelligence wasn't about pulling the trigger. It was about owning the map. Every route, every meeting, every bodyguard's face was catalogued. By late 2019, the Israelis could predict Soleimani's next move with chilling precision. Then, a report changed everything. A Mossad informant embedded in Damascus intercepted chatter suggesting Soleimani planned a high-level meeting in Baghdad to coordinate Iranian-backed militias against U.S. and Israeli interests. The date wasn't fixed, but the tone of the communication was urgent. Something big was about to happen. And for the first time in years, Mossad believed they could catch the ghost off guard. Inside the Glilit compound in northern Tel Aviv, senior officers gathered around a dimly lit conference table. On the wall hung a single satellite image: the route from Damascus to Baghdad International Airport. The room was silent until the director spoke. "We may not get another chance. If we confirm this movement, we act immediately." The decision was clear. The hunt had reached its final act. Every piece of equipment, every agent, every satellite would now be focused on one man. Soleimani had cheated death for decades, surviving wars, bombings, and political purges. But this time, Mossad wasn't chasing a rumor. They had the timing, the location, and the confirmation. All they needed now was the moment. That moment would come on January 3rd, 2020, on a dark runway in Baghdad, when a shadow finally caught its ghost. By late 2019, the walls of Mossad's underground operations center in Tel Aviv looked less like an intelligence office and more like a war room. Maps of Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon were pinned with tiny digital beacons. Drone feeds from the Iraqi desert streamed on a dozen monitors. Photographs of convoys, safe houses, and suspected operatives lined a black wall like a living storyboard. This wasn't just surveillance anymore. It was preparation for an operation that had been years in the making. For Mossad, the challenge wasn't only following Soleimani. It was turning fragmented intelligence into an actionable plan while operating deep inside hostile territory. Iranian-backed militias controlled large swaths of Syria and Iraq. Their intelligence networks were ruthless. Any trace of an Israeli operative in those zones could mean instant death and an international scandal. To manage that risk, Mossad relied on a three-pronged system: signals intelligence, satellite reconnaissance, and human assets. Cyber units tracked encrypted communications between Quds Force commanders. Israeli satellites, positioned high above the Middle East, monitored airports, convoys, and warehouses linked to Iranian operations. And on the ground, Mossad's most trusted human sources, painstakingly recruited over years, sent updates from inside militias, airports, and even local security forces. But as precise as this web was, it couldn't pull the trigger on its own. Mossad needed a partner with reach, firepower, and legal cover. That's when coordination with foreign intelligence, especially the CIA, became indispensable. While the US had the drones and the legal authority to conduct strikes in Iraq, Mossad provided what Washington lacked: real-time intelligence on Soleimani's movements. The cooperation wasn't new. Israeli and American agencies had worked together for decades on joint operations, from sabotaging Iranian nuclear facilities to tracking Hezbollah leaders. But this time, the stakes were higher. Soleimani wasn't hiding in a bunker. He was traveling openly, surrounded by layers of security, in countries where US and Israeli operatives were constantly under threat. The operation required synchronization at a level never seen before. Mossad operatives embedded in Damascus and Baghdad tracked Soleimani's every step. A network of covert sensors placed near key roads monitored convoy movements. Cyber teams intercepted messages between his aides and field commanders. Each piece of intelligence was fed into a secure joint operations cell, where Israeli and American analysts worked side by side. By mid-December 2019, a picture began to emerge. Soleimani was preparing for a high-level trip to Baghdad to meet leaders of Iraqi militias. Mossad's intercepts showed he planned to land at Baghdad International Airport under diplomatic cover, believing himself untouchable. It was the opening they had been waiting for. Yet even with the intelligence, the mission teetered on a knife's edge. Soleimani was notorious for last-minute changes. He often used decoy convoys or switched flights at the last moment. Mossad analysts pored over satellite images, cross-checked flight manifests, and tracked encrypted phone calls to predict his exact arrival. The margin for error was razor-thin. Inside Mossad, a debate raged. Some operatives wanted to capture him alive, believing his interrogation would reveal Iran's deepest secrets. Others argued that such an operation would be impossible without sparking a regional war. The directorate ultimately ruled out capture. This would be a kill operation, clean, quick, and deniable. To make that possible, Mossad needed to map not only Soleimani's route, but also the timing of his security bubble. They studied his motorcade patterns, the positions of his bodyguards, and even the thickness of the armored SUVs he used. They learned how long it took him to disembark a plane, how fast his convoy accelerated from the tarmac, and which gates he used to exit airports. This wasn't simply intelligence, it was choreography. A deadly ballet planned to the second. On the ground in Iraq, the risks multiplied. Iranian-backed militias dominated security at Baghdad International Airport. Any hint of a foreign operation would have triggered immediate retaliation. To avoid detection, Mossad relied on local intermediaries and cutouts, assets who could blend in with airport staff or Iraqi security forces. These operatives provided real-time updates on which vehicles were parked near the runway and which VIP corridors were being prepared. Simultaneously, Israeli cyber teams hacked into local surveillance cameras, giving them eyes on the ground without exposing agents. Drones equipped with ultra-quiet engines loitered miles away, streaming infrared footage back to Tel Aviv. From thousands of kilometers away, Israeli analysts could see the glow of vehicle engines, the movement of bodyguards, even the heat signatures of passengers inside armored cars. But the operation wasn't just about knowing where Soleimani was. It was about ensuring no one knew that Mossad knew. That meant misdirection. feeding false intelligence into channels Iran might intercept, planting decoys, and masking digital footprints so the operation appeared to be an American initiative alone. By late December, the plan had crystallized. Soleimani would arrive in Baghdad on January 3rd. Mossad operatives would provide live tracking of his plane, his convoy, and his movements on the ground. The CIA would execute the strike using armed drones stationed in the region. If everything went to plan, the world would wake up to headlines about the death of Iran's most powerful general, and no one would know how deeply Mossad's hand had been in it. In Tel Aviv, senior officers gathered for the final briefing. On the screen was a satellite image of Baghdad International Airport. Red circles marked the arrival gate, the convoy route, and the kill zone. Every contingency was discussed. What if Soleimani switched cars? What if his convoy split? What if the strike missed? For each scenario, there was a backup plan. This was Mossad at its most meticulous. Years of surveillance, months of coordination, and weeks of planning had built to this moment. But even as they prepared, the operatives knew that one wrong move could expose them and plunge the region into chaos. In the dimly lit room, the director of the operation summed it up in a single sentence. "We are no longer tracking the ghost. We are walking with him." The air above Baghdad shimmered in heat and silence. A few hours before dawn, the city was half asleep, its streets patrolled by tired soldiers and restless cats. But in one corner of the city, near the long runway of Baghdad International Airport, the calm masked something electric. A silent convoy of black SUVs was approaching, headlights dimmed, engines purring. Inside one of them sat a man whose very presence had reshaped the Middle East. Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds force. From thousands of kilometers away, in an underground command center, Mossad's screen operators leaned closer. Their feeds, live satellite visuals, intercepted radio chatter, drone thermal signatures, all pointed to one conclusion. The ghost was in play. For years, he had slipped through their net. Tonight, he was exposed. The mission, months in preparation, was now unfolding in real time. On Israeli monitors, the convoy's position updated with every turn. Coordinates flowed seamlessly to a joint operations channel, the one linking Mossad's tracking grid with American strike control. The world was asleep. But in those rooms, every heartbeat felt like a drum. The operations choreography was near perfect. Mossad's cyber units had breached multiple communication networks, not to jam them, but to listen. They heard security commanders report the convoy's route. They watched as Soleimani's guards switched vehicles at the terminal, believing their routines made them invisible. What they didn't know was that each maneuver had already been predicted, recorded, and logged by Israeli analysts days before. Meanwhile, in the skies south of Baghdad, two MQ-9 Reaper drones loitered at altitude, invisible in the night. They weren't Israeli, but their eyes depended on Israeli precision. Every signal, every movement of the convoy came from Tel Aviv's grid. Mossad had done what it did best: turn patience into a weapon. Inside Baghdad's airport, an Iraqi militia commander named Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis waited for his guest. Their meeting was meant to be short, a debrief after weeks of regional tension. Both men were confident. Neither believed they were being watched. The world had tried and failed to strike Soleimani before. He had crossed borders, survived bombings, and outplayed enemies from Beirut to Kabul. But tonight, every move he made was being mirrored in real time on Mossad's digital wall. At 1:03 a.m., the convoy left the airport gates. The motorcade rolled slowly, unaware that somewhere above the clouds, the drones had received confirmation. The first car carried bodyguards, The second held Soleimani and al-Muhandis, and the third contained local escorts. At 1:07, the first missile hit. The explosion tore through the quiet of the night, a flash of fire that split the desert air. In the command center, operators didn't cheer. They watched in silence as infrared signatures bloomed across the screens. One flare, then another. The second missile followed seconds later, hitting the car carrying Soleimani himself. Within 20 seconds, the entire convoy was gone. The world would later argue about who pulled the trigger. But what the cameras didn't show was how much of the groundwork had already been laid long before that night. From the moment Mossad had mapped Soleimani's habits to the second they confirmed his flight manifest from Damascus. Every detail, every intercept, every movement was the culmination of years of covert Israeli operations, not for vengeance, but to dismantle what they saw as a growing encirclement of their state. Back in Tehran, the first news arrived before sunrise. Reports of explosions in Baghdad spread across encrypted channels. Iranian commanders scrambled to verify who had been targeted. When confirmation came that Qasem Soleimani was dead, silence fell across the room. Moments later, the silence turned to fury. In Iran's holy city of calm, prayers turned into cries of grief. State television interrupted programming to announce what no one believed possible. The man who had commanded the Quds force for over 2 decades, the architect of Iran's regional strategy, the living symbol of resistance, had been eliminated. Inside Mossad's Tel Aviv compound, the lights stayed on. Senior officers gathered in silence as live feeds confirmed the strike's aftermath. The director gave no speech, no celebration. He simply said, "It's done. The balance has shifted. But remember, every action creates a shadow." The following hours were chaos across the region. Militia groups in Iraq went on high alert. Hezbollah mobilized along the Lebanese border. Iranian Revolutionary Guard units began preparing contingency plans for retaliation. The United States closed its embassies across several countries. And in Israel, the air defense grid moved to full readiness. Everyone knew the strike had changed everything. The reaction inside Iran was more than political. It was personal. Soleimani wasn't just a general, he was a symbol. His death united Iran's divided factions under a single banner of vengeance. Thousands poured into the streets, chanting for retaliation. Analysts warned that Iran would not respond blindly. It would plan carefully, methodically, and unpredictably. For Mossad, however, the operation was both triumph and warning. They had succeeded where others had failed, tracking and confirming one of the most elusive military figures in modern history. But they also knew the blowback would come. Iran's intelligence networks were vast, its cyber divisions sophisticated, and its allies deeply embedded across the region. In the coming days, Israeli intelligence began intercepting chatter, encrypted traffic between Iran, Lebanon, and Iraq, hinting at coordinated plans for revenge. Iran's military doctrine didn't favor rash attacks. It preferred attrition, deniability, and precision. Mossad analysts knew what that meant. The war in the shadows was about to escalate. In Washington, politicians debated the legality and wisdom of the strike. In Tehran, generals debated how to avenge it. But in the middle, in the gray, secret corridors of intelligence, both sides understood something deeper. This was no longer about one man. It was about control of the unseen battlefield. The war of spies, codes, and invisible hands. As dawn broke over the Middle East, smoke still lingered over Baghdad's airport. A few twisted frames of metal were all that remained of the convoy that had once carried the region's most feared commander. The ghost was gone, but his death would awaken storms far beyond the reach of missiles. Tehran before dawn was unrecognizable. The streets that once hummed with morning prayers now echoed with sirens, the wail of ambulances, and the rhythmic cries of millions in mourning. Across every Iranian city, from Mashhad to Shiraz, men and women poured into the streets holding Soleimani's portrait, not as a general, but as a martyr. In those moments, the Islamic Republic wasn't divided by politics, class, or ideology. It was united by grief and rage. Behind the closed doors of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, the mood was darker still. The country's leadership sat around an emergency table. The president, the IRGC's top commanders, and intelligence chiefs. They all knew this moment would define Iran's next decade. One of them reportedly said, "This is not an act of war. This is a declaration." The question wasn't whether to respond, it was how. Iran's first instinct was restraint. In the opening hours after the assassination, they needed clarity. Who had coordinated it? Was it purely American? Or had Israeli hands guided the strike from the shadows? Within 24 hours, the answer came through intercepted chatter. Mossad fingerprints were all over the tracking operation. The precision, the pattern analysis, the timing, it was unmistakable. From that point onward, Iran's response wasn't about vengeance for one man. It was about reclaiming deterrence. The IRGC's Quds force initiated Operation Martyr Soleimani, a carefully calibrated plan that would signal strength without triggering all-out war. Within days, missile silos across western Iran came online. Their targets, U.S. military bases in Iraq, specifically Ain al-Assad and Erbil, both known to host American and Israeli-linked intelligence assets. But this wasn't the only theater. In parallel, Iranian cyber units launched Operation Sejil, a wave of silent attacks targeting Israeli defense servers and civilian infrastructure grids. It was the digital battlefield's first taste of the revenge Tehran had promised. On January 8, 2020, as the world held its breath, dozens of Fateh 3113 and Qam missiles roared out of Iranian territory. It was the first open missile attack on U.S. forces since World War II, a deliberate, precise strike meant to prove that Iran could retaliate and still control escalation. At 1:30 a.m., the first wave struck Ain al-Assad base. Explosions lit up the night sky as warheads slammed into hangars, runways, and control towers. Radar systems scrambled, and sirens wailed across the desert. The Pentagon would later report no casualties, but independent analysts and satellite imagery painted a different picture. Dozens of destroyed aircraft, shattered bunkers, and injured personnel evacuated under blackout conditions. Iran's message was clear. We choose the battlefield. We set the terms. In Israel, the mood shifted from satisfaction to anxiety. For months, Tel Aviv had operated in the shadows, assuming plausible deniability. Now, the veil was gone. Iranian state media began hinting openly that Mossad had provided the intelligence behind Soleimani's killing. Online, photos of Israel's defense systems circulated alongside promises of retaliation. Inside Israel's military headquarters, the Iron Dome network was set to full alert. Patriot and Arrow batteries were repositioned to cover critical infrastructure. Tel Aviv, Haifa, Dimona. But even as the defense system stood ready, Iran's cyber divisions found another way in. Over the following weeks, several Israeli infrastructure systems experienced unexplained failures. Power fluctuations, water system malfunctions, even temporary disruptions in air traffic monitoring. None caused major casualties, but each served as a message. Iran could reach deep inside Israel without launching a single missile. And when Iran's allies in the region, Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, and Houthi units in Yemen began coordinating symbolic strikes and drone flights near Israeli-controlled zones, the message grew louder. The shadow war was now out in the open. Publicly, Israel celebrated Soleimani's death as a blow to Iran's ambitions. Privately, intelligence officials were uneasy. Killing a man like Soleimani, didn't he dismantle the network he built? It only unleashed the lieutenants who had learned from him. Within weeks, new Quds Force leaders emerged, continuing operations in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Mossad's post-operation assessments reflected that unease. Yes, they had achieved their tactical goal, eliminating a major adversary, but the strategic cost was steep. Iran had consolidated regional sympathy, its influence in Iraq had grown, and anti-Israel sentiment surged even among Arab populations that had quietly supported normalization. One analyst described it bluntly: "We removed a man, but we awakened a movement." In Washington, the mood was celebratory at first, but as intelligence reports came in showing the extent of the Iranian response, the damage to U.S. bases, the cyber breaches, the regional unrest, that confidence eroded. The administration soon realized that Soleimani's death didn't cripple Iran's influence. If anything, it made Tehran more unpredictable, more unified, and more determined. By early February, Iran had fully restructured its Quds Force Command and expanded its regional operations budget. Meanwhile, Hezbollah began tightening its coordination with Iran's intelligence units, while new proxy cells emerged in Syria and Yemen, a quiet but effective counterbalance to Israeli operations. The most profound consequence, however, was psychological. For decades, Israel's enemies feared Mossad's reach, the myth of an agency that could strike anywhere, anytime. But after Soleimani's assassination, that fear evolved into something else: respect mixed with resolve. Tehran had learned how far Israel was willing to go, and Israel learned how fast Iran could adapt. It was no longer a game of deterrence. It was a duel of endurance. The region settled into an uneasy silence. Both sides had drawn blood. Both sides had proven their power. And somewhere, deep beneath Tel Aviv, Mossad's analysts continued their work, watching, listening, waiting for the next move. Because in the world of covert wars, there's never really an ending, only pauses between operations. Soleimani's death may have ended one chapter of Middle Eastern warfare, but it also unleashed a new era of spy games, assassinations, and shadow wars that continue to shape the region today. Stay tuned. This is Spy Wars Declassified.